The door to the Whitlock homestead came off its top hinge when his boot met the wood, and the sound of it, that crack, that splintering, was the last ordinary sound Mara would ever hear inside that house. She spun from the stove, her 5-year-old son Evan still clutching a half-eaten biscuit, and there was Voss in the doorway, with 2 men behind him, and a piece of paper in his gloved hand. He dropped the paper on the table like it was refuse he was tired of carrying. "You've got until sundown," he said. "After that, I start moving your things into the road myself." The paper was a deed. His name was on it. Her name was not. Evan pressed himself against Mara's leg, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and she did not move, and she did not speak because she understood, in that moment, that the man standing in her kitchen had already decided how this ended. The only question left was whether she would make it harder for him, or easier. She chose harder, but not that day. That day she chose to live. If you've ever had something taken from you, not lost, not misplaced, but taken by someone who looked you in the eye while they did it, then you already know what Mara felt walking out of that house in the snow, with her boy's hand in hers, and nothing but a sack of flour on her back. You know that particular kind of cold, the kind that has nothing to do with the weather. This is her story, and it's one I think you need to hear. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Stories like this one take time to tell right, and your support is what makes it possible to keep going. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to the winter of 1887 and to a woman who had every reason to give up and didn't. Snow had been falling for 3 days without stopping. When Mara Whitlock's leg finally gave out, it wasn't a dramatic collapse. There was no moment of warning, no staggering, no cry. One step her boot broke through a crust of ice she hadn't seen under the drifted powder, and her ankle rolled with a sound she felt more than heard, a dull, dense pop that traveled up through her calf and into her knee, and then she was down on one hand and one knee in the snow, with Evan beside her, his small face gone pale. "Mama, I'm fine," she said. She said it the way mothers say things that aren't true but need to be said anyway. And Evan was 5 years old, but he was not stupid. He looked at her ankle, already beginning to press against the inside of her boot, and then he looked at her face, and he did not say anything else. Mara pressed her palm flat against the snow and pushed herself upright. Pain moved through her in a wave sharp enough to blur her vision for a moment, and she stood there, breathing through her teeth until it steadied. The flour sack was still on her back. She had not dropped it when she fell. That, at least, was something. They had left the town of Dalton Creek 4 days earlier, or what passed for a town, a feed store, a post office, a saloon that doubled as a meeting hall on Sundays, and a sheriff who had looked the other way so many times in Gideon Voss's direction that his neck had practically locked in that position. There was no lawyer in Dalton Creek, not anymore. The last one, a slight man named Aldridge, had packed his office and left in September after a fire consumed his records. Nobody said Voss had anything to do with it. Nobody said much of anything when it came to Voss. Mara had not gone to the sheriff. She had not gone to anyone in Dalton Creek. She had taken the deed, the real one, the one with her late husband Thomas's handwriting across the bottom margin, where he'd noted the survey date, the one Voss didn't know she had, and she had sewn it into the lining of Evan's coat while the boy slept. And the next morning she had picked up the flour and her son, and she had walked out into the cold. Her plan was the town of Harrow's Bend, 2 days' travel east over the ridge, where a land attorney named Beckett had an office and a reputation for taking cases that other men wouldn't touch. 2 days had become 4. The storm had come in faster than she'd expected, and her leg was now telling her, in no uncertain terms, that 2 more days was not going to happen. She looked around. The trees here were old-growth pine, dense enough that the snow barely reached the ground between them, and ahead through the timber, she could make out a shape that was not a tree, straight line where no straight lines should be, and then another, a roof line, a chimney with a thin thread of smoke rising from it. Her first thought was that it might be Voss's men. He'd put word out quickly. She'd heard it in Dalton Creek before she left, whispers at the dry goods counter, a man she half recognized from Voss's outfit watching her from across the street. There was a bounty. She didn't know the exact number, and she'd told herself that not knowing was better. The smoke was real, and the cold was real, and her ankle was swelling inside her boot so badly now that each step was a small negotiation with her own body. She kept walking. Silas Rourke had not been expecting anyone. He never was, which was more or less the point of living where he lived 3 miles beyond the last fork in the trail that most people in this valley considered the edge of the known world. He had 8 cattle, a decent-sized vegetable seller, a mule named Porter, who had a disagreeable personality, and no visitors between October and March. This was not an accident. He had arranged his life with considerable care to arrive at exactly this arrangement. He was splitting wood when he heard it, not footsteps, the snow-swallowed footsteps. What he heard was a voice, high and thin, and carrying the particular quality of desperation that a child's voice gets when desperation is the only option left. Mister, please." Silas set the axe down. He turned. The boy was standing at the edge of the tree line, which meant the boy had come a good 40 yards through open ground to reach him, which meant either the boy had more nerve than sense, or he was past the point of caring about the difference. He was small 5, maybe 6, with a tear in his coat at the left shoulder, and his face so red from cold it was nearly purple. He was alone. "My mama fell down," the boy said. "She says she's fine, but she's not fine." Silas looked past the boy toward the tree line. "Where?" "Back there. She told me to stay with her, but I didn't." There was a flicker of something on the boy's face. When he said it, not guilt, exactly, but the cousin of guilt. The awareness that he'd done something his mother told him not to do, and had done it anyway, because he'd decided he knew better. And the exhausting question of whether he'd been right. Silas grabbed his coat off the fence post where it was hanging and walked. He found her maybe 60 feet into the trees, sitting with her back against a pine with the flower fasac beside her, and her jaw set in the expression of a person who has decided not to give anyone the satisfaction of watching them struggle. Her ankle was visibly wrong, even from a distance, the boot leather bulging in a way that made wince involuntarily. She looked up at him, and there was a moment brief, impossible to miss, where something moved behind her eyes. Not relief, not yet. Something more complicated. The calculation of a woman who has been making rapid assessments of strange men for the past 4 days, and has developed strong opinions about which ones can be trusted. "My son wasn't supposed to. He did the right thing," Silas said. Crouched down and looked at the ankle without touching it. "Can you put weight on it?" "I can manage." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "Not right now." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the flour sack with one hand and held out his other arm, and after a pause that lasted exactly as long as her dignity required, Mara took it. She was lighter than she should have been. He noticed that the way you notice something and then file it away without commenting on it, the way you notice things about a person in the first few minutes that tell you something about the weeks before you met them. She was lighter than she should have been, and the flour sack was mostly empty, and Evan's coat had a tear in it that had been recently and badly mended with thread that didn't match. They'd been at this a while. Whatever this was, he didn't ask. Cabin was 1 room and a loft, which was more than Silas needed, and less than most people would want. And it smelled the way all wood-heated buildings smelled in winter smoke and pine resin and something close to warmth. Not the thing itself, but the memory of it. He got Mara into the chair nearest the stove, and he got the fire banked up properly, and then he stood and looked at the ankle. "Boot's going to have to come off," he said. "I know that. It's going to hurt. I know that too." Cut the lace rather than trying to loosen it. The swelling had made that impossible, and he worked the boot off as carefully as he could, which was careful enough, but not careful enough to prevent the sound Mara made through her teeth, a sound she was clearly trying to keep from becoming louder. Evan was standing in the middle of the room, watching with the particular stillness of a child who is trying very hard to be invisible. The ankle was swollen, but not, Silas thought, broken. He'd seen broken. This was bad, but not that kind of bad. He got cold water and a strip of cloth, and he wrapped it, not too tight, and when he was done he found the extra blanket from the loft and put it around Evan's shoulders, because the boy had stopped shivering, and that was sometimes worse than shivering. "There's stew on," Silas said. "From this morning." "It's not much." "We're not here to take your food," Mara said. "Stew's already made. Eating it isn't taking anything." She was quiet for a moment. Evan looked at her. Some small negotiation passed between them without words. "Thank you," she said. It sounded like it cost her something. Silas heated the stew, and he found the end of a loaf of bread, and he watched the boy eat with the focused determination of a child who has been told to slow down, but has decided that particular instruction does not apply in emergencies. He himself ate standing the way he usually did, leaning against the back wall with the bowl in both hands. He noticed Evan looking at the coat hanging by the door. It was a boy's coat, small, dark wool, hanging on a peg at a height that hadn't been relevant in 4 years. Silas had not taken it down, and he had not put it away. He had not made a decision about it. He had simply continued not making a decision about it, which amounted to the same thing. Evan looked at the coat and then looked at Silas and then looked carefully away. Silas looked at the coat too. "You can sit down," Mara said quietly. "You don't have to stand there like you're guarding the wall. He almost said something about preferring to stand. Instead, he sat. It was later Evan asleep on the cot in the corner, the fire lower, the room doing the thing rooms do in the deep cold, when warmth becomes something you can almost touch, that Mara said, "The tear in his coat. I've been meaning to fix it properly." Silas glanced at Evan's coat where it was draped over the boy's feet. "Got thread," he said. "He had a better coat. I sold it." She said it simply, without apology or explanation, the way you say a fact when you've already processed all the feeling attached to it and come out the other side of it. "In Dalton Creek. Got $3. We needed the $3 more than we needed the coat." Silas said nothing for a moment. "Was Thomas your husband?" She looked up. He nodded toward the flour sack, where the initials T.W. were burned into the burlap. An old brand, faded but legible. "Yes," she said. "He died 14 months ago. Mine collapse." "I'm sorry." "The collapse was Voss's fault," she said. "He knew the supports were compromised. He had reports. He chose not to fix them, because fixing them would have cost money, and he decided the math worked out in his favor." She said it with a flatness that was worse than anger. Anger meant you still believed things could be otherwise. That flatness meant she had already arrived at the far shore of what had happened and had been standing there long enough to know the ground. After Thomas died, Voss filed a new deed with the county. Our land, our house, his name on it. The original deed disappeared from the records office. She paused, but I had a copy. Silas was quiet. Thomas was meticulous, she said, and something shifted briefly in her face. He wrote everything down. He kept copies of copies. I thought he was excessive about it. I used to tease him. She stopped. "The original deed is in Evan's coat lining. I sewed it in myself. Voss's men have searched my wagon and my bags twice since I left. They didn't find it. The fire settled. Outside, the wind was picking up again, finding the gaps in the eave boards and making its presence known. There are men looking for you," Silas said. "Yes, and you came this direction. The storm pushed me off the main trail." She met his eyes. "I wasn't planning to involve anyone else. But here you are." "Here I am," she said. There was no self-pity in it, just acknowledgement, the ledger of where she'd planned to be versus where she actually was, and that gap between them. Silas looked toward the window at the dark and the snow pressing against the glass. He had made a life out of not involving himself. After he lost his son, after he lost both of them, Clara in the winter fever and their boy Daniel just a month later, 2 losses so close together that they blurred into one enormous single absence, he had made a deliberate and considered choice to stop being the kind of man that things happened to. He had come out here. He had stayed out here. He had built his life small and tight and manageable, and he had told himself that was practical rather than cowardly, which was a conversation he continued to have with himself periodically and had never fully resolved. He looked at the small coat draped over Evan's feet. He looked at Mara, who was watching him without any expression on her face, not asking for anything, not performing, just waiting. "You should sleep," he said finally. "Your ankle needs to be elevated. Take the cot, I'll move the boy to the loft. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She stopped. He got up and he lifted Evan, who barely stirred, and he carried him up the loft ladder with the careful precision of a man who remembers the particular weight of a sleeping child, and he did not let himself think about what he was remembering or why. He just climbed the ladder and set the boy down and pulled the blanket up to his chin. Evan, without waking, reached out and closed his small hand around two of Silas's fingers. Silas stayed very still for a moment. Then he carefully extracted his fingers and climbed back down. He found Mara watching him, with an expression he couldn't read, and he looked away before she could, and he sat down in the chair by the stove, and he watched the fire burn lower, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Outside, the snow fell and fell, covering the tracks they had made, and covering the trail, and covering the road that led back toward Dalton Creek and toward Gideon Voss, who did not yet know exactly where she was. But he would. That was the thing about men like Voss. They had patience, and they had money, and they had men who got paid to be patient on their behalf, and those things, combined, had a way of finding what they were looking for. Mara knew it. Silas, sitting in his chair and listening to the wind, was beginning to understand it. The flour sack sat on the floor beside the stove, nearly empty. The fire burned. The boy slept. And the silence in that cabin, for the first time in 4 years, felt like something other than nothing. He was already awake when she started talking. Silas had not slept well. He rarely did in winter, when the cold made the cabin walls contract, and every small sound carried differently than it did in warmer months. And he'd been sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, gone cold beside him, when he heard Mara shift on the cot and make a sound that was not quite a word, and not quite a cry. He looked over. Her eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, and she was breathing in the careful way of a person who has woken from something bad and is working to put distance between herself and it. He didn't say anything. He just got up and put more wood on the fire, and by the time he turned around, she was sitting up with her back against the wall and her ankle extended in front of her. "How long have you been awake?" she asked. "A while." She looked at the window. The sky outside was still the deep gray of very early morning, not quite dark, not quite light. "Did you sleep at all?" "Some." She didn't push it. That was something he noticed about her. She asked a question, and when she got an answer, even a thin one, she let it stand. She didn't circle back around to it with a different angle the way some people did. Whether that was respect or simply exhaustion, he couldn't tell. She tried to swing her feet to the floor, and the expression that moved across her face, when her ankle took any weight at all, was brief but unmistakable. "Stay there," Silas said. I'll get it." He brought water, and he built the fire up properly, and he checked the ankle, which was still swollen, but the color was better than it had been the night before, more yellow than purple, which wasn't pretty, but was progress. He rewrapped it with a clean strip of cloth, tighter than last time, now that some of the initial swelling had receded, and she sat very still through the whole thing with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set. "You've wrapped ankles before," she said. "Had cattle that rolled theirs on bad ground. Process is roughly the same." She looked at him. "I'm not comparing you to a cow," he said. "I didn't assume you were." Something almost passed for a smile on her face, there and gone before it fully arrived. He went to make more coffee. Evan came down from the loft about an hour later, with his hair pushed sideways from sleep and one sock half off, and he stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked at Silas with the assessing expression of a 5-year-old who is trying to remember what he knows about where he is. "Good morning," Silas said. Evan considered this. "Is there food?" "Evan," Mara said. It's a fair question, Silas said, and he got the boy a piece of bread and some of the dried apple he kept in a tin above the stove. And Evan took it and sat on the floor near the fire, with his legs crossed, and ate with total concentration, as though bread and dried apple required his full intellectual attention. Silas watched him without meaning to, and then looked away. The morning passed slowly, the way mornings did out here, when the weather kept you inside. The snow was still coming down, lighter now, and the sky had gone from deep gray to pale gray, which was not the same as improvement, but at least indicated that the sun was making an effort somewhere above the cloud cover. He found some spare wool in the chest by the wall, and he sat down with a needle, and he worked on the tear in Evan's coat, which was worse than it had looked last night. The lining was pulling away from the outer fabric at the shoulder seam, and someone had tried to stitch it shut with thread that was too light and too short, and the repair had lasted maybe a week before the coat reopened along the same line. He didn't comment on it. He just pulled the old thread and started again with something that would hold. Mara watched him do it. She watched him the way she'd been watching him since last night, with that careful, measuring quality, not hostile but not easy either. Like someone who has learned through specific and painful experience that the cost of misreading a person can be very high, and has adjusted accordingly. "You know how to do that," she said. "I've had to do most things for myself out here. Most men can't sew." "Most men won't," Silas said. "Different thing." She was quiet for a moment. Thomas couldn't. He tried once, sewing a button back on his work shirt, and it took him the better part of an afternoon, and when he was done, the button was on sideways. She paused. He was very proud of it anyway. Silas kept his eyes on the needle. "He sounds like someone who finished what he started." "Yes," she said. And then quieter, "Yes, he was. He tied off the thread and held up the coat and checked the seam, and it was straight and it would hold." He set it aside and looked at her, and she was looking at the fire. It was mid-morning when she told him about the deed in full. Not because he asked. He hadn't asked. But the fire was going, and Evan had fallen back into a doze on the cot wrapped in the blanket. And there was something about the particular quality of silence in a warm room in a snowstorm that had a way of loosening things that people had been carrying tightly. She told him about the land first. 40 acres in the valley below the eastern ridge, good soil, decent water access from a creek that ran year-round. Thomas had homesteaded it 7 years ago, before she knew him, and he'd filed the papers himself in the Harrow County Records Office, and he'd kept a copy because that was the kind of man he was. They'd built the house together. She said it that way. Together, and Silas understood. She meant it literally. That she had driven nails and carried timber, and they'd had 2 good years, and then 2 hard years, and then 1 year that was neither one nor the other, just ordinary survival, which was in its own way a kind of success on the frontier. Then the mine company had come. Voss hadn't built the mine himself. He'd bought the operation from a man named Cutler, who'd run it into the ground both financially and literally, leaving behind tunnels that were inadequately shored and a workforce that had learned to read the condition of the support beams the way sailors read weather. Thomas had worked the mine for supplemental income, which was common enough. Lots of men in the valley did. The collapse had happened on a Thursday in September. 4 men had gone down and 3 had come up. He was in the second tunnel, Mara said. The one that the foreman's report, the one that was filed afterward, the official one said, was structurally sound. The week before, Thomas had told me the timber was wrong. He said the wood they'd used for the cross supports was green. It hadn't cured. He said it to the shift foreman, and the shift foreman wrote it down, which Thomas also told me, because Thomas noticed when things got written down. She stopped. Port is gone now, every copy of it. But Voss knew. Voss knew before the collapse. He had a second report, a private assessment from a mining engineer out of Denver. It said the tunnel was at critical risk. He sat on it for 6 weeks. She said it without raising her voice, just laid it down. I can't prove that in a court of law. Not yet. But the deed, the original deed, is what I can prove. Voss knows it. Silas looked at her. How did you find out about the private report? Voss's bookkeeper, a man named Syke. He left Voss's employ in November. After the fraud, after he saw what Voss was willing to do to clear the land title, and he left a letter with the postmaster in Harrow's Bend, addressed to anyone who could make use of it. Postmaster sent word to me through a woman at the dry goods store. She shook her head slightly. Took 3 months to reach me. I spent most of those 3 months trying to figure out whether Sykes was telling the truth or whether Voss had planted the letter to see what I would do with it. What did you decide? That it didn't matter. The deed was what mattered. Deed is what I have. Outside, the wind found a gap somewhere in the eave and made a low, sustained sound, almost like breath. Evan shifted on the cot but didn't wake. This lawyer in Harrow's Bend, Silas said. Beckett, you know him, know of him. His reputation's decent. He paused. The trail to Harrow's Bend is 2 days in good weather. In this, he looked at the window, 4, maybe 5, and your ankle isn't walking 4 days on rough ground. I know that. So you need to stay here until it's better. Voss's men are looking for me. I know that too. She looked at him directly. This isn't your problem, Silas. He noticed she'd used his name. She'd been careful not to until now. He realized she'd been not using it the way you don't use something, when you're trying to keep a careful distance. And now it had slipped out, not dramatically, just the way things slip when your guard is down. He didn't comment on it. Maybe not, he said, but you're in my cabin, and your boy is asleep on my cot, and it's snowing. So until the weather breaks, the practical reality is that this is where you are. She held his gaze for a long moment. You could ask us to leave. Could. Why haven't you? He was quiet. The fire popped once, settling. He looked at the coat he'd mended, folded over the back of the chair, with the repaired shoulder seam facing up. Because it's snowing, he said again. She didn't believe that was the whole answer. He didn't expect her to, but she let it stand. In that way she had. The snow stopped the following afternoon. It didn't clear, the sky stayed the low, closed gray of deep winter, but the falling stopped, and by evening, Silas had shoveled a path to the barn and checked the cattle and come back inside to find that Mara had, against all reasonable instruction, gotten herself to the table and was sitting there with her ankle propped on the adjacent chair and a look of grim satisfaction on her face, like she'd won an argument. Nobody else knew was happening. I needed to move, she said, before he could speak. Did moving go well? She thought about it. Better than yesterday. He said nothing. He hung his coat and washed his hands and started the evening's meal, which was cornbread and the last of the salt pork, and Evan helped him in the inexpert way that 5-year-olds help getting underfoot, asking questions about every step of the process, at one point trying to stir the pot and nearly sending it sideways off the stove, and Silas moved around him the way you move around. Something that isn't a problem, but requires minor navigation. And gradually, without planning it, the movements became practiced, the boy anticipating which way Silas was going to step and adjusting accordingly. Mara watched this from the table. She watched it the way she'd watched him mend the coat, with that same careful, measuring attention, but something in it had shifted. He couldn't say exactly what. After they ate, Evan pushed his empty bowl aside and looked at Silas's with the direct, uncalculated gaze that small children deploy before they ask questions. Adults have decided not to answer. Where did that coat come from? Evan asked. The one on the peg. Mara's hand tightened slightly on her own cup. Silas looked at the coat, the small dark wool coat on the peg at the height that hadn't been relevant in 4 years. Belonged to a boy, he said. What boy? My son! Evan processed this with the thoroughness that children apply to information that doesn't fit their existing categories. Where is he? He died, Silas said, a few years ago. He was about your age. Evan was quiet for a moment. What was his name? Daniel. Evan looked at the coat again. Then he looked back at Silas. I'm sorry about Daniel, he said. He said it simply, without flourish, the way children sometimes say true things because they haven't yet learned to be afraid of them. Silas had spent 4 years not talking about Daniel. He had spent 4 years being very careful about not talking about Daniel moving around the subject in his own head, the way you move around a wound that hasn't healed and might not heal, and you've made your peace with that, or you've told yourself you have. Thank you, he said. It came out rougher than he intended. He got up and cleared the bowls and stayed at the basin with his back to the room for a moment longer than necessary, and when he turned around, Evan was telling Mara about a dog he'd seen in Dalton Creek, a brown dog with one white ear, and the moment had passed, or at least moved sideways, which was the closest thing to passing it was going to get. 2 days after the snow stopped, the first rider came. Silas saw him from the barn, which was where he was when most things happened, because most things that needed doing involved the barn. The rider was on the main trail, which was a quarter-mile south and barely visible through the trees as a dark line where the snow had been broken by previous travel. And he was moving slowly, too slowly, for someone who knew where they were going. Pace of someone reading the land, looking for something. Silas stood in the barn doorway and watched. The rider stopped on the trail for a long moment. He seemed to look in the direction of the cabin. The distance was too great to read expression or detail, but there was something in the stillness of him. The way a dog goes still when it catches a scent that turned something cold in Silas's chest. Then the rider moved on, continuing east, and disappeared into the tree line. Silas went inside. Mara was at the table again, working on something she'd found, a piece of rough canvas in his supply chest, and she was stitching it, her hands moving with the efficiency of a woman who has done close work in poor light for years. She looked up when he came in and read something in his face before he spoke. "Someone on the trail, rider," he said, moving slow, stopped for a bit. She set the canvas down. "One that I saw." She looked at the window. "They'll have split up. Cover more ground." Silas pulled a chair out and sat. "Tell me how many Voss is likely to send." He sent 3 before. 2 hired guns and someone who knows the county, usually a man named Heck Ferris. Ferris was a deputy once, years ago, before Voss found better uses for him. She said it with a flat precision that told him she'd already thought through this many times. Ferris is the one to worry about. The other 2 are hired for what they can do with a gun. Ferris is hired for what he can figure out. What does Ferris know about you? He knows I left Dalton Creek heading east. He knows I have the deed. He knows I have a child, which means I'm slower than I would be alone. She looked at her ankle. He also probably knows I was injured. If any of the people I passed in the valley talked, did any of them see which direction you turned? "One," she said. "A woman at the edge of town. She was kind. I don't think she would have told them willingly." She paused. But willingness has limits when a man like Ferris is asking. Silas thought about this. He thought about the geography, the trail system through this part of the valley, the ways in and ways out. Which of his neighbors were close enough to be relevant and which were not? There was only one neighbor that mattered out here, and that was Harlan Mercer, whose place sat 3 miles north on higher ground. Harlan was a practical man. He was also, Silas was fairly sure, someone who would find Gideon Voss morally repugnant on general principle, because Harlan had a deep and steady dislike of men who used paper and legal maneuvering to take what they wanted, having lost a parcels of his own land in a boundary dispute with the county 15 years ago. The grudge was specific and durable. "I need to send word to someone," Silas said. "Who?" "A neighbor. He knows a land attorney in Harrow's Bend. Might even be the same one you're looking for." Mara looked at him carefully. "Why would you do that?" The question was genuine, not accusatory, just direct. She wasn't asking why he'd want to help. She was asking the specific question of why he would extend himself, put himself in the path of Voss's attention, for people he'd known less than a week. He thought about the rider on the trail, stopped, reading the landscape. He thought about the coat on the peg. "Because Voss's men have already been on my trail," he said. "Whether I help you or not, they've seen this direction." "That's already done." He paused. "And I'd rather do something useful with a problem I'm already in than nothing." She held his gaze for a long moment. "If you send to your neighbor and Voss finds out, Harlan's been dealing with people trying to intimidate him since before I got here. He'll be fine. You can't know that. No, he agreed. I can't. Mara looked at the window. The light was going flat, the gray of the sky deepening toward the gray of evening. Evan was in the loft, which he'd claimed as his specific territory over the past 2 days, and they could hear him up there, moving around, doing whatever it was he did from the sound of it. Complex series of activities involving the 2 blocks of scrapwood Silas had given him to stop his hands from being idle. I want to fight it, she said, not run from it. I've been running she stopped. I've been running since before Thomas died, when I could see what Voss was building. Always moving, always keeping ahead of the next thing he was going to do. She looked down at her hands. I'm tired of it. Not in the way that makes you want to stop, in the way that makes you want to turn around. You want to make him come to you, Silas said. I want to meet him somewhere I've chosen, not somewhere he's herded me to. Silas was quiet for a moment. He turned this over. Not for the first time, in the past 3 days, he found himself looking at this woman and seeing someone who had been making decisions under sustained pressure for long enough that the decisions had become something else. Not just choices, but a kind of constitution, a set of principles worked out through necessity until they were as solid as anything he knew. Then here, he said. She looked at him. If Voss is coming and he is, we don't have to wait for him to find us on his terms. I'll get word to Harlan. Harlan gets to Beckett. If the deed is what you say it is, Beckett brings the documentation, and we receive Voss here, on this ground, with witnesses and a legal record that makes what he's been doing impossible to hide. And if Voss comes before any of that can happen. Silas said nothing for a moment. Then we deal with that, he said, with a rifle. If it comes to it, she looked at him steadily. You'd fire on a man for land that isn't yours. For a woman and a child on my property, he said, which it is, until they leave. After those, the land isn't the point. The fire settled. The sound of Evan in the loft stopped for a moment, then resumed. Mara looked at her hands, at the canvas she'd been working, the window where the light was almost gone. I've spent 14 months not trusting anyone, she said finally, trying to figure out which of the people in front of me wanted something from me and what it was, and whether I could afford to give it. She paused. I don't know what you want. Nothing, Silas said. She looked up. I don't want anything from you, he said. I don't want the land. I don't want... He stopped himself, reorganized. I just don't want Voss to win. Not even on general principle, and not specifically here, not with this. He looked at Evan's coat, folded on the chair, the shoulder seam straight and tight where he'd mended it. Some things are just wrong, and you don't need a reason beyond that. Mara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the coat, too. All right, she said. Send to your neighbor. Silas went to Harlan's the next morning, before light, taking the long way around through the north pasture to avoid the main trail. He was back by mid-morning. He didn't tell Mara what had been said, specifically, only that Harlan had listened and had agreed and was already planning his ride to Harrow's Bend. Harlan characteristically had expressed his view of Gideon Voss in a sequence of specific and profane terms that Silas summarized only as unfavorable and left it at that. That afternoon, Mara walked without the crutch for the first time, not far across the cabin and back, and then once more, and the third time she'd made it to the door and opened it, and stood in the cold air for a moment, looking out at the white expanse of the yard. She was limping, and she was holding the doorframe, and it was not graceful, but it was her own weight on her own feet, and the expression on her face when she turned back inside was not triumph so much as grim satisfaction. The same expression he'd seen the first time she'd made it to the table. Evan watched her from the middle of the room. Good? He asked. Getting there, she said. That evening Silas cut a proper crutch from a straight piece of ash he'd had in the woodpile for months, intending it for a fence post. He shaped the top into a padded fork with a piece of leather and fitted it to her height. She took it without comment but tested it twice, adjusting her grip, and he could see she was calculating distances, assessing what she could do now that she couldn't do yesterday. 3 riders, she said that night when Evan was already asleep. Silas looked up from the rifle he was checking. Voss doesn't come himself, usually, she said. He sends Ferris and 2 others. But this time, she stopped. This time, I think he'll come himself. Because of the deed. Can't trust anyone else to handle it, not with what's at stake. What makes you think that? Because I would, she said, if I were him. If the only thing standing between me and losing everything I'd built was one piece of paper in someone's coat lining, she paused. I'd want to be there. Silas set the rifle across his knees. If he comes himself, he'll want it quiet. He can't afford a scene. Too many people would ask questions. Unless he decides that there's no one out here to ask questions. Fire burned. Silas thought about the rider on the trail, stopped, reading the landscape. Then we make sure there's someone, he said. The night outside was absolute no wind, no movement, the cold having settled in so completely that the world had gone still. Somewhere out there Harlan was riding. Somewhere out there, Ferris was reading the snow, tracking the impression of boot prints and the angle of disturbed branches and all the small, legible signs that a woman and a child leave behind when they move through wilderness because they have no choice. And somewhere out there, Gideon Voss was making his own calculations. Question was whose arithmetic was going to hold. Mara sat at the table with the crutch against the wall beside her, and her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on the fire. And she did not look afraid, exactly. She looked like a woman who has decided that whatever happens next, she will not be the one to look away first. Silas checked the rifle's action one more time. Then he set it beside the door within easy reach, which was where it would stay until this was finished one way or another, and he went to add more wood to the fire, and the cabin settled into the particular silence of people waiting for morning. Morning came without announcement. No wind, no sound from the trail, nothing to mark the shift from night to early light, except the slow change in the quality of darkness pressing against the cabin windows. Silas was already up. He'd been up since 4, which was not unusual for him, but this morning the reason was different. This morning he was up because sleeping felt like a decision he couldn't afford. He had the fire going and coffee made, and he was standing at the window when Mara came down from the loft. She'd taken the loft after the second night, when her ankle was stable enough for the ladder, insisting that Evan sleep on the cot where it was warmer. She moved carefully on the ladder, favoring her right side, and at the bottom she reached for the crutch he'd left propped within arm's reach, and fitted it under her arm without breaking stride, as if the whole operation had been choreographed. She looked at the window, at the rifle by the door, back at the window. Anything, she asked. Quiet, he said. She accepted this and poured coffee and stood beside the stove with both hands around the cup. The crutch leaned against the wall next to her. She'd adapted to it quickly, quicker than most people would have, he thought. But then Mara adapted to things quickly as a matter of survival. You could see it in everything she did. The way she moved through an unfamiliar space without bumping into things. The way she watched doors. Evan slept well, she said. Good. He trusts this place. She paused. That's the first time he's slept all the way through since we left the homestead. The first time since Thomas died, maybe. Silas looked at his coffee. Children know things, she said. Not through reasoning, just through some other thing. He knew the cabin was safe before I did. Are you sure it is? Silas asked. Not challenging her. Asking. She turned her head and looked at him directly. No, she said. But I know it's safer than anywhere else I could be right now. And I know you haven't given me a reason to leave. So, here we are. Here they were. The morning moved the way mornings did out here, slowly and with intention. Silas went out to the barn, and Mara stayed inside. And when he came back, Evan was up and eating, and showing his mother something a small carving, Silas realized, done in one of the scrap pieces of wood he'd given the boy. It was rough, recognizably an attempt at a horse, the proportions ambitious and the execution approximate, but the effort in it was evident in every cut mark. Look, Evan said to Silas, holding it up. Silas took it and turned it over in his hands. Who taught you to carve? Nobody. I watched you. When you made the crutch. Silas looked at the carving again. He handed it back. "You've got a good eye," he said. "The neck's a little long, but the legs are right." Evan looked at the horse with the critical expression of an artist receiving his first real note, and Silas could see him deciding whether to be wounded by it or to take it as information. He took it as information. "I'll fix the neck," he said. "Use the small knife. More control." Evan nodded seriously and went back to the floor near the fire, and Mara watched all of this without saying anything. But the expression on her face was the kind that doesn't have a clean name, the kind that contains too many things at once, gratitude and grief, and something that might have been hope if she'd been willing to look at it directly, which she wasn't. Not yet. The second rider appeared on the third day after Silas had gone to Harlan. This one came closer. Silas saw him from the tree line at the east edge of the property, where he'd gone to check the fence posts in the lower pasture, a task that needed doing. And that also gave him a clear view of the trail without being visible from it. The rider came up the southern approach, and he stopped on the rise that looked down toward the cabin, and he was there for a long time. Long enough that it stopped being someone resting a horse and started being someone making an assessment. Then a second rider appeared beside the first. Silas counted. 2, both still. One of them raised a hand and pointed in the direction of the cabin, and then both of them pulled back into the trees and were gone. He walked back to the cabin at a pace that was faster than usual and not quite running, and he came inside and closed the door and said, "2 riders on the south rise. They've seen the cabin." Mara set down what she was holding. "Did they come down?" "No." Pulled back into the trees. "Ferris," she said. "He wouldn't come down without all 3. He'd wait until Voss was there." She thought for a moment. "Which means Voss is coming. When? Today or tomorrow. Ferris is not a patient man when he's close." She looked at Evan. The boy was at the table and had looked up at Silas's entrance with the particular alertness of a child who has learned that fast movement by adults means something is happening. Mara's voice changed, not dramatically, just enough. "Evan, take your horse and go up to the loft, all right? I need to talk to Silas about something." Evan looked between them. He was 5, but he was not simple, and he understood that what he was being told was only partly about the loft. "Okay," he said. He picked up his carved horse and went to the ladder without protest, which was its own kind of signal, a child who understood when the adults needed to speak without managing his feelings simultaneously. When he was up, Mara turned back. "I need to know what we have," she said. "What can you actually do if they come today?" "Rifle. Handgun. I can shoot." "How well?" "Well enough." She looked at him steadily. "It's not an answer." "I shot a deer at 200 yards in October," he said. "Moving. Took it clean." She absorbed this. "Ferris will have a rifle. The 2 he brings, they're close-range men. Mostly. They rely on numbers and the threat of it. They're not soldiers." She paused. "Voss carries a pistol, but he's not a shooter. He's a man who hires shooters." "Good to know." "It's not good," she said. "It just means if it comes to a gun, Ferris is the one to worry about, not Voss. But Voss won't let it come to a gun if he can avoid it. He'll try to make it legal. Show papers, assert his claim. Make it look like he's the one being wronged." Her jaw tightened. "He's very good at that. Making it look like he's the one being wronged." Silas went to the window and looked out. The south rise was empty, or appeared to be. The tree line was too dense to read from here. "How long do you think Harlan needs?" she asked. "To get to Harrow's Bend and back?" He thought about it. 3 days out, if the trail was clear when he went. Coming back depends on whether Beckett moves quickly. Beckett won't move quickly for a rancher he doesn't know. "Harlan's persuasive," Silas said, "and he has history with this kind of thing. He'll know how to put it." She didn't look fully reassured, which was the honest response. "If they come before Harlan gets back," she said, "what do we do?" "We stall," Silas said. "We make Voss prove his claim before we respond to it. Every legal claim requires verification. That's something even Voss knows. He'll have papers, forged, but they'll look correct. Papers can be disputed, and disputed papers take time." He looked at her. Can you stand on that ankle long enough to face him? The question was practical, not unkind. She treated it that way. Yes, she said. Then when they come, you stand on the porch and you let him talk and you make him feel like he's winning right up until the moment he realizes he isn't. He paused. Can you do that? She looked at him for a long moment. That's exactly what he did to me, she said. For 2 years, I thought I was handling things. I thought I was managing the situation, and the whole time he was. She reorganized. Yes, I can do that. They came the next morning. Sound arrived before they did not hoofbeats. The snow swallowed those, but the specific silence that falls over open ground when something is moving through it that shouldn't be there. Silas knew that silence. Animals knew it. Every living thing in winter learned the sound of a predator approaching, because that particular quality of absence had a weight to it. He was at the window before he'd consciously decided to be. 3 riders, coming up the main approach from the south, not trying to conceal themselves now, which meant they decided concealment was no longer necessary. The man in front was not Ferris. Silas had never met Ferris, but Mara had described him, lean and deliberate, a man who moved like someone counting steps. The man in front was broader, better dressed, sitting his horse with the posture of someone who has never once in his life considered that he might be the one in the wrong place. That would be Voss. Silas turned from the window. Mara was already up. She was dressed and she had the crutch, and she was looking at him with her jaw set and her eyes clear, and a kind of cold steadiness that he recognized because he'd felt it himself in the only moments of his life when the thing he'd been dreading had finally stopped being something approaching and become something here. Evan, she said without raising her voice, I hear them. The boy was in the loft. His voice was careful, too controlled for a 5-year-old. He'd been listening. You stay up there, Marissa said. You stay quiet and you do not come down. Not for any reason. Pause. Okay, Mama. Silas took the rifle from beside the door. He checked the load, which he'd already checked twice that morning. Checking it a 3rd time was not paranoia. It was the kind of discipline that made the difference between a decision made clearly and one made in the moment when clarity was hardest to maintain. I go out first, Mara said. He looked at her. They came for me, she said. Not you. If you go out first, it changes the shape of what this is. Vuss needs to see me. He needs to think he has the advantage. She met his eyes. Let him think it. He wanted to argue. The specific, practical part of him that had been calculating risk and ground and position for the past 3 days wanted to argue that a woman on a crutch was not the right opening move when 3 armed men were in your yard. But the other part, the part that had been watching her think and plan and hold herself together under the kind of sustained pressure that broke most people, that part understood that she was right and that she had been thinking about this moment longer and harder than he had, and that the calculation she'd arrived at deserved respect. I'll be right behind you, he said. I know, she said, and she went to the door and opened it. Cold hit her immediately. She felt it in her ankle first. The cold always found the weak place, and then across her face and hands. She positioned the crutch and moved out onto the porch with the careful deliberateness of a woman who knows she cannot afford to stumble. And she stopped at the top of the porch steps and looked at the 3 men in her yard. Voss pulled up his horse about 20 feet from the porch and looked down at her the way he always looked, at things he considered already decided. He was heavier than she remembered, or maybe it was the coat. He wore a long, dark coat, good quality, the kind of coat that announced, without announcing that its owner had money and intended you to know it. His face was broad and weathered, and his eyes were the particular flat blue of a man who has gotten what he wanted, often enough that wanting has become a reflex rather than a feeling. Beside him was Ferris, who was exactly as Mara had described, lean and still, a man who looked at things without committing his expression to any response to them. And on the other side, a younger man she didn't recognize, probably the replacement for one of Voss's previous hires. Someone who'd been found cheaper or more willing. Mrs. Whitlock, Voss said. His voice was calm. He'd made it calm. She could tell there was something underneath it that wasn't calm at all. Mr. Voss, she said. He looked at the cabin, at the door behind her, at the crutch, at the yard, taking inventory. That's a bad leg. I manage. Looks like you've been managing quite a lot. He shifted in the saddle with the ease of a man settling into a familiar conversation. Long way to come in winter, especially with a child. He paused. Where's the boy? Inside, she said, where he'll stay. Something moved across Voss's face. Not quite displeasure. More like a man rearranging a minor inconvenience in his mental accounting. I've got no quarrel with the boy, Mara. You know that. I've got no quarrel with you, either. Really. I've got a legal matter that needs to be settled, and you've got something that belongs to me. I've got something that belongs to me, she said. Smiled. The smile did not reach the flat blue eyes. Now, see, that's the disagreement. And disagreements like this one have a process. The county recorder's office has a process. And the process says, show me your papers, Silas said. Voss looked past Mara to the doorway, where Silas was standing with the rifle in the crook of his arm. Not raised. Just present. Voss looked at him with the expression of a man encountering a variable he hadn't factored and deciding rapidly whether it changed his arithmetic. And you are? Voss asked. This is my property, Silas said. You're on it. Show me the papers that say you have a claim to the woman standing on my porch, or explain to me what legal basis brings 3 armed men to my door. Ferris had gone very still. Not in the way of someone startled, in the way of someone who is very good at his work and has just shifted from one kind of readiness to another. Voss looked between them. His smile didn't entirely leave men. Like Voss kept the smile as a kind of armor, but it thinned. I have a deed filed with the Harrow County Recorder, Voss said. Signed and witnessed. Mrs. Whitlock is in possession of a fraudulent document that she claims supersedes the legal record. Criminal matter. Is it? Silas said. Because from where I'm standing, you've got 2 filed deeds, which means one of them is fraudulent, and the question of which one is going to take more than 3 men on horseback to answer. The law in Harrow County. Harrow County's 2 days east, Silas said. The law in Harrow County is not presently in my yard. You are. He looked at Voss steadily. What exactly are you proposing to do here? Mr. Voss? Mara watched Voss's face. She had been watching it for 3 years. Longer, if she counted the time, before Thomas died, when Voss had been merely a presence in the valley rather than a threat. She knew its movements. She knew the slight tension at the corner of his mouth that meant he was calculating. She knew the way his eyes moved when he was deciding between 2 courses of action, the slight flick, left and then right, like a man checking which exit was closer. He was checking the exits now. Mrs. Whitlock, he said, and his voice had dropped the pleasantness. Not entirely, but enough that she could hear the architecture underneath it. You have something in your possession that causes a great deal of unnecessary complication. If you produce it, we can resolve this without anyone having a bad morning. Without me giving up my land, you mean, she said. It's not your land. That's the whole point. It was my husband's land, she said. Filed, witnessed, and recorded. And my husband's name was Thomas Whitlock, who died in a mine collapse that you had reports about 6 weeks before it happened. The yard went quiet. Not a comfortable quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight. Ferris's horse shifted under him, and Ferris put a hand on the reins without looking down, the automatic response of a man keeping his mount steady out of habit while his attention was entirely elsewhere. Voss's face had gone flat, not angry that might have been easier, just flat. The expression of a man who has heard something he did not expect to hear said out loud in daylight, in front of witnesses. That's a serious accusation, he said. It's a statement of fact, Mara said, and I have a witness who can support it. She did not have the witness here. Sykes was in Harrow's Bend, or had been in November. She didn't know where he was now. But Voss didn't know exactly what she had and what she didn't, and the look on his face told her that the mention of a witness had found something. Gap. A place where the certainty he'd walked in with was not quite as solid as it had appeared. I'm going to need you to step off that porch, Mara, he said. I'm going to need you to leave my property, Silas said. Voss turned the flat blue eyes on Silas with the full weight of a man who has used that look to end conversations for 20 years. This doesn't concern you. You're on my land, Silas said. Everything on my land concerns me. Ferris spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet and precise, the voice of a man who said things once and expected them to be heard. There are 3 of us, he said, and 1 rifle. There are 2 rifles, Silas said. You're counting the one you can see. This was true. He'd put the spare rifle inside the door at Mara's height, within her reach from the porch if she needed it. Whether she could shoot accurately on one leg with a crutch under her arm was a different question, but Ferris didn't know that, and the uncertain math of confrontation had a way of producing conservative choices in men who valued their own lives more than their employer's land dispute. Ferris looked at Silas, then he looked at Mara, then he looked at the cabin door. Voss's horse had started to sidestep, picking up something from its rider, the kind of small, involuntary tension that moved from a man's body to an animal's without anyone deciding to send it. This is not finished, Voss said. Probably not, Silas agreed. But it's finished for today. You'll want to move on. The younger man at Voss's right had not said a word. He was watching Silas with the expression of someone who has been hired to perform a service, and is now privately revising his understanding of what that service will cost him. Mara could see him reassessing. She'd known men like him in Dalton Creek, not bad men, not good men, men in the middle who went the direction the wind was blowing, and right now the wind was uncertain. Voss looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. There was something in his face then that she had not seen before, in all the time she had been managing and calculating and surviving him. Something that was not quite the absence of certainty, but was close to it, a man so accustomed to the arithmetic working out in his favor, finding perhaps for the first time that the numbers in front of him were not behaving. He pulled his horse back. You should think carefully about your next move, he said to Mara. I have been, she said. For 14 months. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned the horse and rode south, and Ferris and the younger man followed, and the sound of them going was swallowed quickly by the snow and the trees, and then they were gone. Mara stood on the porch and did not move until she was certain they were past the south rise. Then she let out a breath that was not quite steady, and tightened her grip on the crutch, and she became aware that her hands were shaking, which was the body reporting on what it had been doing while her mind was focused on other things. The door opened behind her and Silas was there. Sit down, he said. I'm fine. Your hands are shaking. I know they are, she said without turning around. That doesn't mean I need to sit down. He was quiet. Then he stepped out beside her and looked south toward the tree line. He'll be back, she said. Tonight? No, he needs to regroup. He didn't expect... She paused. He didn't expect me to say Thomas's name out loud. The mine. He didn't expect that. She turned slightly. Did you know that was what I was going to say? No, he said. Prized him. And men like Voss, she stopped. They're most dangerous when they've been surprised, because they don't have a plan for it, and so they make one quickly, and quickly made plans are sloppy. She looked back at the tree line. He'll be back tomorrow. Maybe tonight after dark, if Ferris talks him into it, with a different approach. What approach? I don't know yet, but he'll come back angrier and with less patience for conversation, and that means... She stopped. We need Harlan to get back, I know, Silas said. How much time do we have? He thought about it. Harlan had gone 4 days ago. 2 days to Harrow's Bend. 1 day to find Beckett and make the case. 2 days back. That was 5 days. Which meant today at the earliest. Tomorrow was more realistic. Maybe today, he said sedately. More likely tomorrow. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then she opened them and looked at the tree line again. Mama? Evan's voice came from inside the cabin. Not panicked, carefully neutral, which was its own kind of worry. It's all right, she called back. Come down. She heard his feet on the ladder rungs, careful and deliberate, and then he was in the doorway, looking at her with those eyes that were Thomas's eyes, the particular dark that was specific to that face and no other, and she made herself smile because he needed to see it, and because finding something to smile about was the bravest thing she knew how to do. Are they gone? He asked. For now, she said. He looked at her hands. She had stopped shaking, or she had made herself stop. Were you scared? She thought about lying. She thought about what Thomas would have said, and what he would have done, and what he had always believed about children and honesty. Yes, she said, but being scared and being able to do something anyway, that's the whole thing. That's all any of it is? Evan thought about this with the seriousness he applied to all information that seemed important. Silas wasn't scared, he said. Silas, behind her, made a sound that was approximately a laugh but quieter. I was scared, he said. I was just busy. Evan looked at him. That's what scared feels like when you have something to do. Pretty much, Silas said. The boy nodded slowly, as though filing this away. Then he looked south, in the direction the riders had gone, and his small face settled into a look that was more adult than 5 years should have been able to hold. And Mara reached out and put her hand on his shoulder and felt him lean into it, just slightly, the involuntary way. The afternoon was tense in the way of weather building. Silas stayed close to the cabin, within sight of the approach trails, told Mara he was checking fence posts, and she did not believe him, and he did not push the pretense. They were past pretense now. She spent the afternoon thinking through every exchange with Voss she could remember, every conversation, every legal document she'd seen or not seen, every name he'd used, and every name he'd avoided. She was looking for the shape of what he would do next. Because Voss was a man who operated within a limited set of moves, his intelligence was real, but his imagination was not generous. He thought in terms of pressure and leverage, and the appearance of legitimacy. He was not creative. He was thorough. That thoroughness was the problem. A creative man improvised, and improvisation created gaps. Voss would come back with something that looked airtight on its face, something that would require documentation to dispute, and he would time it for the moment when that documentation was hardest to produce. She said as much to Silas when he came back inside. He might try to get a county official out here, she said, or someone claiming to be one. A man with papers and a badge, real or not, changes the equation, makes it harder for you to simply refuse entry. I'm not required to let anyone onto my property without a proper warrant, Silas said. Not even a county official. Try explaining that to a man with a rifle. My own rifle in the conversation, he said. She looked at him. You understand what you're committing to here. I understand that Voss committed to it when he rode into my yard. It was the most direct he had been about it, and something in it settled something in her chest that had not been settled since this all began. Not safety, she knew better than to call it that. The specific relief of not being alone, which was different from safety, but mattered in its own way. Fire burned lower. Evan was at the table with his carving, working on the horse's neck with the small knife under Silas's earlier instruction, his tongue between his teeth, his face arranged in an expression of total absorption. Tiny curl of wood fell to the table, then another. Silas was at the window again, and then, just before the light went completely, he straightened. Someone coming, he said. North Trail. Mara was up and at the window before the crutch was fully positioned. From the North Trail, not the South approach, not the direction Voss had come from. The North Trail. 2 horses. One of them Harlan Mercer's gray. She could see the color even in the failing light. And beside it, a smaller dark horse carrying a man in a town coat. Not a rancher's coat. A coat that didn't belong in this landscape, but was wearing it anyway. Is that she started? That's Harlan, Silas said. And then after a pause, and someone else. The someone else rode with the careful, upright posture of a man not accustomed to distance riding but committed to it. And as they came closer, Mara could see the bag strapped to his saddle. Not a saddlebag exactly, more like a case. The kind a man carried when he was transporting documents he couldn't afford to damage. Beckett, she said. The word came out without air behind it. Silas turned from the window. His face was doing something that was close to relief, but older than relief. the particular expression of a man who had committed to a course of action based on limited information and is learning, late, that the information was right. They made it back, he said, simply. Mara stood at the window and watched the two horses come up the north trail, and she thought about Thomas, who wrote everything down and kept copies of copies, and once spent an afternoon trying to sew a button onto his shirt and came out of it, triumphant, the button sideways, proud as a man who has built a house. She thought about what Thomas had believed, which was that the right thing done thoroughly was more powerful than the wrong thing done quickly. He had believed it, and he had lived it, and she had watched it get him killed, and she had spent 14 months wondering whether the belief itself had been the problem. Standing at that window, watching a man in a town coat ride through the snow with a bag of documents on his saddle, she thought maybe the belief was not the problem. Maybe the problem had simply been that Thomas had done it alone. "Evan," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "Come look at this." The boy slid off the chair and came to the window and looked. "Who are they?" he asked. "The man on the gray is Harlan," Silas said from the other side of him. "He's a friend." "And the other one?" "The other one," Mara said, "is someone who might be able to help us." Evan looked at the approaching riders for a long moment. Then he looked up at Silas, and then at his mother, and then back at the window. "Is it going to be okay?" he asked. It was the question she'd been asking herself for 14 months. She had not had an answer that she trusted. She had not known how to give him one, because she had refused to give him something she couldn't stand behind. She looked at the riders, at the case on the attorney's saddle, at Harlan Mercer, who had ridden 2 days in winter cold because Silas Rourke had asked him to, and because some things were just wrong, and you didn't need a better reason than that. "I don't know yet," she said, "but it's better than it was this morning." Evan accepted this with the gravity of a boy who has learned to take truth in whatever form it arrives, and he stood between his mother and Silas at the window of a cabin that was not his home and watched the two riders come out of the north. And outside the snow had stopped again, and the last light of the day was the specific pale gold that comes just before the cold dark takes everything. And in that light, the riders were very clear against the white. Silas went to the door and opened it, and the cold came in, and he went out to meet them. And Mara stood in the doorway on her crutch, with her hand on Evan's shoulder, and watched, and she did not allow herself to feel the hope that was trying to exist in her chest, because hope required something. From her she was not ready to give yet, but she stood there, and she did not look away. And that, for now, was enough. Voss would come back. She knew it with certainty. The way you know certain things not because you wish them, but because you understand the person well enough to know what they cannot do. And what Gideon Voss could not do was leave a loose end. Tomorrow he would come back. He would come back with whatever he'd managed to construct overnight, harder and less patient, and there would be no conversation this time. The time for conversation was what today had been, and they had used it. What tomorrow would be was a different kind of reckoning altogether. Harlan dismounted in the yard and shook Silas's hand with the brief, efficient grip of two men who trust each other and don't need to demonstrate it. The man in the town coat dismounted more carefully, checking his footing in the snow, and he lifted the document case from his saddle with both hands and held it against his chest. He looked toward the porch, toward Mara. She looked back. Neither of them said anything yet. There was too much ground between them, the literal distance of the yard and the larger distance of what it had taken. To get here her 14 months and his 2 days, and everything that those distances meant. But he had come, and he had brought the case, and that was its own kind of statement. Silas turned and looked back at her. "Come inside," she said to all of them. Cold. They fit 6 people into a one-room cabin that was built for one, and the walls didn't complain. Harlan Mercer was a broad man, not tall but wide in the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered past the point of expressing things it didn't mean, and he came inside and stood near the door for a moment, looking at the cabin, with the assessing expression of a man who checks the structural integrity of spaces as a matter of habit. Then he looked at Mara, and something in his face settled. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Harlan Mercer. I've got a place 3 miles north of here. Silas said you needed help." "He was right," she said. Harlan nodded once, as though that was the entire conversation that needed to happen between them. Then he stepped aside, and the man behind him came forward with his document case and his town coat, and the careful expression of a man who was very good at one thing, was aware that the one thing he was good at was the only useful thing in this particular room right now. "James Beckett," he said. He extended a hand and she took it. Grip was dry and precise like his voice. "I understand the situation has a timeline." "It may," she said. "Voss came yesterday. He'll come back." "When?" "Today or tomorrow." "Probably today." Beckett looked at Silas, who nodded confirmation. Then Beckett set his case on the table, and the sound of it, the specific weight of a case full of documents set down on a wooden table, was the most serious sound the cabin had made since Silas had dropped the wood on the fire 3 days ago. "Then we'd better start," Beckett said. Evan had retreated to the far end of the room, near the foot of the loft ladder, and was watching the newcomers with the stillness of an animal that hasn't decided yet whether a new thing is a threat. Harlan noticed him the way experienced men notice children, without making a production of it, without crouching down to be level, or using the slightly too cheerful voice that adults deploy when they are afraid of small people. He just looked at the boy and said, "You, Evan?" "Yes, sir." "Your mama's been carrying something heavy for a long time," Harlan said. "She's almost done carrying it." Evan looked at him for a moment. "How do you know?" "Because I brought the man with the papers," Harlan said simply. "And papers beat everything else, if they're the right ones." Evan looked at Beckett, at the case. Then he looked at his mother, and she gave him the nod that meant it's all right. "Stay where you are," and he stayed. What followed was not dramatic in the way of the things that had come before. It was the grinding, meticulous work of documentation, which is its own kind of tension, the tension of details, of specificity, of the space between what a piece of paper says and what it means, and whether those two things can be made to align in a way that holds up when someone with more power and worse intentions pushes against them. Beckett spread his documents on the table. Mara spread hers, or rather, she removed her coat from the peg and took the small knife from the shelf and cut the lining of Evan's coat with the careful precision of a woman who had sewn it in herself and knew exactly where the seams were. She extracted the deed the way you extract something you have been protecting for a very long time, with both hands, deliberately. She set it on the table. Beckett looked at it. He did not touch it yet. He looked at the handwriting, at the margins, at the condition of the paper, at the seal impression at the bottom corner. Then he took a pair of reading glasses from his coat pocket and put them on and looked again. "This is Thomas Whitlock's signature?" he asked. "Yes, you can attest to that. I lived with the man for 6 years, she said. "I know his handwriting like I know my own." Beckett looked at the signature a moment longer. Then he looked at the documents he'd brought copies of the Harrow County recorder's filing, the deed that bore Voss's name, the survey records, and 2 notarized witness statements that Harlan had apparently collected in Harrow's Bend from men who had known Thomas Whitlock and knew the original filing date. Beckett had moved quickly, Mara thought, quicker than she would have expected from a man she didn't know. He said so. Harlan was persuasive, Beckett said, without looking up from the documents. Harlan, from his position near the stove where he was warming his hands, said nothing. But something shifted briefly in his face. "The fundamental question," Beckett said, "is provenance. The Voss deed was filed 14 months ago, 6 weeks after Thomas Whitlock's death. The original deed," he gestured at what Mara had set on the table, "was filed 7 years ago. The issue is that the original filing appears to have been removed from the county records. Someone accessed those records and took it. Or had someone take it," Silas said. "Yes. The practical effect is the same." Beckett looked at Mara over the reading glasses. "What I have here are the witness statements from 2 men who were present at the original filing. They can attest to the date, the content, and Thomas Whitlock's signature. combined with the physical document itself, which, if the paper stock and ink are consistent with 1,880 origin, is verifiable. This is a strong case. But not an immediately settled one, Mara said. No. Land disputes of this kind go through a county court process. That takes time. He paused. What I can do today is create an official legal record of this document's existence and the competing claims, witnessed and notarized, which makes Voss's position significantly more precarious. Any action he takes against you after that point, any physical removal, any seizure becomes a criminal matter on top of the civil dispute. He already tried to intimidate her with 3 armed men, Silas said. Yesterday. Beckett looked at him. I need you to write that down. Time, number of riders, what was said. I need it as a sworn statement. I'm not a court. You don't need to be. A sworn statement from a landowner and an attorney's documented record of competing claims creates a paper trail that a county judge cannot ignore. He looked at Mara. This doesn't resolve everything today, but it changes what Voss can do. Dramatically. Mara looked at the 2 documents on the table. Thomas's careful handwriting on one, Voss's filed claim on the other. 2 pieces of paper representing 2 entirely different versions of what was real. The one that had been in the system, in the official record, carried institutional weight regardless of how it got there. The one that had been in a coat lining for 14 months had the truth on its side, which in her experience was a related but not identical thing. How long does the court process take? She asked. 2 months, maybe 3. It won't be simple. Beckett looked at her steadily, but simple was never going to be an option with Gideon Voss. No, she said. It wasn't. Beckett worked at the table for 2 hours with the focused economy of a man who has learned to do precise work in poor conditions, which was more or less the prerequisite for practicing law on the frontier. He wrote in a clear, dense hand. He referenced his documents and cross-referenced them and made notes in the margins, and twice asked Mara to clarify specific dates, which she provided with the exactness of a woman who had been keeping those dates in her head like stones in a pocket for over a year. Harlan sat near the stove and said very little, which seemed to be his customary mode. Silas made coffee and brought it to the table, and Beckett drank it without seeming to notice he was doing it, which Mara recognized as the specific absence of attention that comes when someone's mind is fully occupied elsewhere. Evan eventually moved from the loft ladder to the floor near Harlan, and after a while Harlan produced a coin from somewhere, a silver dollar, and showed the boy a simple trick with it, making it walk across his knuckles and disappear into his closed fist, which Evan watched with an expression of absolute concentration and then demanded to know how it worked. Practice, Harlan said. Show me again. I'll show you once more. Then you figure it out. It was an odd quality of stillness that settled over the room, the attorney working. The rancher teaching the child a coin trick, Silas at the window, Mara at the table with her documents spread for her. Fire burned. The light outside remained flat and cold, and then Silas said, "They're here." The room reorganized itself in an instant, not chaotically. Everyone moved with the clarity of people who have been thinking about this moment and have already made their decisions about what to do in it. Beckett capped his ink and gathered his documents into the case without rushing but without wasting a single motion. Harlan palmed the coin and stood. Silas went to the door and his rifle went with him. Mara looked at Evan. Loft, she said. This time, he went without question, and the speed of his compliance, no protest, no negotiation, just the recognition that this was one of those moments, was something she would carry with her for a very long time. Climbed the ladder, and she heard him move to the far corner of the loft, the farthest point from the front of the cabin. Then she took the crutch and went to the door. There were 4 of them this time. That was the first thing she registered. 4, not 3. Voss had added someone overnight. The 4th rider hung back near the tree line, which told her he was there for a different purpose than the others. Not a hired gun. Someone official-looking. A man with a jacket that carried the suggestion of authority even from a distance. Voss pulled up short of the porch. He looked different today. The pleasantness from yesterday was completely gone, not even the shadow of it. What was there instead was the compressed energy of a man who has run the numbers overnight and does not like what they came out to, and has decided that the solution is to apply more pressure faster. "I'm not here for conversation," he said. "I have a county deputy with me. He has a removal order." The fourth man came forward. He was younger than Mara expected, maybe 30, with the uncertain expression of a man doing something he has told himself is legal while keeping one very careful eye on the definition of legal. Beckett stepped out onto the porch beside Mara. Voss stared at him. "Who are you?" Voss said. "James Beckett," Beckett said, "attorney at law, Harrow County. I've been retained to represent Mrs. Whitlock's claim to the property at issue." He looked at the deputy. "I'd like to see the removal order." The deputy Mara could see the uncertainty on his face more clearly now. The slight hesitation of a man who was not expecting to encounter a lawyer reached inside his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out. Beckett came down the porch steps with the careful deliberateness of a man who was not going to hurry for anyone, took the document, unfolded it, and read it. The yard was very quiet. Ferris was watching Beckett with the fixed attention of a man recalculating. The fourth rider, the deputy, was watching Beckett with something closer to relief, as though the presence of an attorney had given him permission to let someone else carry the weight of this. Voss was watching Mara. She watched him back. "This removal order references the Harrow County recorded deed of October 1885, Beckett said. "However, I have here." He reached into his case, which he'd brought out under his arm, and produced a document. A notarized affidavit establishing the existence and prior filing date of a competing deed, the original homestead claim filed by Thomas Whitlock in March of 1880, 5 years prior. He held it up, not handing it to the deputy, just making sure it was visible. Any removal order issued against a property under active legal dispute is procedurally invalid until the dispute is resolved by a county court. The deputy looked at the affidavit. He looked at Beckett. He looked at Voss. "Mr. Voss," he said, and his voice was careful. "You told me the claim was settled." "It is settled," Voss said. His voice had gone tight. "The county record." "The county record is being formally contested as of this morning," Beckett said. "I filed the contest notice with the Harrow County Clerk's office 2 days ago. You were served notice." He looked at Voss. "Weren't you?" It was not a question. Something moved through Voss's face. Not the absence of certainty this time. This was past. This was the specific expression of a man who has built a structure over a long period of time and is watching a single load-bearing element begin to give way and understanding, in real time, what that means for everything above it. "This is interference with a legal proceeding," Voss said. "This is a legal proceeding," Beckett said. "The one Mrs. Whitlock has initiated to recover her property. I'd suggest, Mr. Voss, that you consult your own attorney before taking any further action regarding this land, because what you do from this point forward will be part of a court record." Voss looked past Beckett to Mara. "You think this changes anything?" he said. His voice was low now. Not a performance anymore. The real thing underneath it. "You think a piece of paper and a hired changes everything," Mara said. She said it without raising her voice. She said it because it was true, and because she spent 14 months getting to the place where she could say it. And the saying of it was its own thing, separate from what came after. Separate from the legal process, and the court date, and the 2 or 3 months that Beckett had warned her about. The saying of it was hers, and she said it. Voss's jaw tightened. "You're going to regret, Mr. Voss." Silas's voice came from the doorway. He was standing with the rifle, and his voice had the specific flatness of a man who has been patient and is now finished with patience. "You've been told what the legal situation is. The deputies heard it. You've got no grounds to be on this property today." Ferris said something quietly to Voss. Mara couldn't hear it, but she watched Voss's face while Ferris said it, and she saw the slight change, the compression, the rapid recalculation. Ferris was telling him to leave. Ferris, who was paid to get results, was reading the ground and telling his employer that this was not the ground to get them on. Not today. Voss looked at the deputy. "You have an order." "I have an order that this attorney says is invalid," the deputy said. And then, more quietly, "I'm not going to force a removal on contested property, Mr. Voss. That's not, I can't do that." The silence that followed was the heaviest silence the yard had held yet, and then Voss reached for his pistol. It was not a slow movement. It was not a dramatic one. It was the movement of a man who has run out of options and has not yet accepted that, and so is doing the one thing he still has control over, the one move left in a game he's losing. The reflex action of someone who has never in his life been told no and meant it. The shot came before the pistol clears its holster. Silas fired from the doorway a single shot, the sound of it enormous in the cold air, the kind of sound that empties the mind of everything that isn't the present moment. Struck Voss in the right shoulder and knocked him sideways, in the saddle, and the pistol went into the snow. And Voss made a sound that was not a word, but contained everything a word could. All the shock and the pain and the collapse of the certainty that had held him upright for 20 years. The horses scattered. Ferris had his own weapon halfway clear before he looked at Silas at the rifle, at the absolute steadiness of the man holding it, and then he looked at Harlan, who had appeared in the doorway with the spare rifle, and he made the decision that a man makes when he is very good at calculating odds, and the odds have moved past the point of argument. He put his hands up. The younger man behind him did the same, quickly, with the expression of someone who is very glad this moment has arrived. The deputy had not drawn. He had his horse under control, and his hands visible and his face arranged in the expression of a man who is going to need to write a very detailed report about this and is already composing it. Voss was slumped sideways in the saddle, his right hand clutching his left arm across his body, his face the color of old ash. He was not going to die from a shoulder wound, but he was going to hurt for a significant amount of time, and he was, for the first time in the entirety of Mara Whitlock's acquaintance with him, entirely without the next move. "Get down off that horse," Silas said. Voss got down. It took time, and it was not dignified, and no one moved to help him, and no one was going to. Harlan came down the porch steps and took the horse's reins, Ferris's and the younger man's, and tied them to the fence post with the unhurried competence of a man who has done similar things in different circumstances. Ferris and the younger man stood in the snow with their hands visible, and Ferris's face was perfectly neutral in the way of a man who is already adjusting to a new reality and has decided that adjusting quietly is the better strategy. Beckett came off the porch with his case and crouched beside Voss in the snow. "Gideon Voss," he said, in the measured tone of a man reading from a prepared text he has been composing for some time. "You are under civil claim for fraudulent filing of a land deed, conspiracy to deprive a widow of her lawful homestead, and by witness account present here today, attempted assault with a deadly weapon." He stood. "The deputy will take your statement. I'll be filing everything else with the county court on Monday morning." Voss looked up at him from the snow. Then he looked at Mara. She looked back. There was nothing in his face now that resembled the man who had walked into her kitchen with his boot through her door. That man had been large and certain, and had carried the specific gravity of someone who believes the world is arranged around his convenience. This man was small in the way that people become small when the thing holding them up turns out to have been other people's fear rather than anything real. "It was my land," he said. His voice had lost its shape. "No," Mara said. "It was never your land. You just decided it was, and no one stopped you until now." He had nothing to say to that, which was its own kind of answer. The deputy took Voss and his men north toward the county seat, Ferris and the younger man riding under supervision, and Voss in the deputy's own saddle, with a bandage around his shoulder that Beckett had tied with the competent efficiency of a man who had apparently dealt with gunshot wounds before. The deputy had said very little through the whole process, but he had said enough. He had stated clearly, in front of witnesses, that he had observed Voss reach for a weapon on an uncontested property owner's land, while in the presence of legal counsel, and that he would so attest in his report. Beckett watched them go, and then turned back to the cabin with the expression of a man mentally reviewing a list. Court filing stands, he said to Mara. The affidavit, the witness statements, the physical deed, it's a strong case. Stronger now, with the deputy as witness to what happened. He paused. Criminal charge for the assault will be a separate matter, but the sheriff's office in the county seat will be expecting my communication. Will it hold? Mara said. The case. Beckett was quiet for a moment. He was not the kind of man who offered reassurance when reassurance wasn't supported by the evidence, which she had already decided she respected. Deed is genuine, he said. The witness statements are solid. Voss's filing is 14 months old and in a corrupted record that we can now point to as corrupted. Case will hold. He looked at her. I won't tell you it will be simple. I told you that before. But it will hold. She nodded. One motion. The nod of someone receiving information they have been bracing for so long that even good information still feels like impact. Beckett packed his case, and Harlan brought the horses around, and they made their arrangements to leave before the light went completely. Harlan, at his horse, looked at Silas. You all right? He said. Fine, Silas said. Harlan looked at him for a moment, reading the answer for what was underneath it, which was the habit of a man who had known Silas Rourke for 8 years, and understood that fine meant something specific and not always accurate when Silas said it. That was a clean shot, Harlan said. I wasn't trying to kill him. I know, still clean. Harlan mounted. He looked at Mara. Ma'am, you've got the backbone of a woman who should have been a circuit judge. Take that, she said. He nodded once, and they rode north, and the sound of the horses went away, and then there was just the cabin, and the yard, and the snow, and the fire going behind the door, and the sun going down, somewhere behind the clouds, in a way that turned the sky, briefly from gray to something warmer before the dark came. Silas was standing in the yard with the rifle still in his hands, looking at the place where Voss had stood, not thinking exactly, just standing with it. Mara came to stand beside him. You didn't have to do that, she said. He was drawing. I know. But you could have let it go differently. She looked at the depression in the snow where Voss had fallen. You chose to stop it instead of ending it. I'm not a man who ends things if there's another way, he said. Came out quieter than he meant it to, more honest than he'd planned. She was quiet for a moment. The cold was absolute, the kind that presses against every exposed surface and makes the boundary between inside and outside very clear. Is your hand steady? She asked. He looked at his hand. It was not shaking. He thought about whether the steadiness was a good thing or simply a thing. Yes, he said. Good, she said. She turned toward the cabin. Come inside. The cabin was very quiet that evening, quieter than it had been with 6 people in it, quieter than it had been with the tension of what was coming occupying every corner. Evan came down from the loft when Mara called him, and he looked at both of them and at the room and at the absence of anyone else. And he said, Is it done? Part of it, Mara said. The part where men come to take our things. And the other parts? The other parts take longer, Silas said. But they go through a court now, not through someone's front door. That's different. Evan thought about this. He sat on the floor near the fire with his carved horse in his lap, and he was quiet for a long time, which was unusual enough that Mara glanced at Silas, who looked back at her and then at the boy. You okay? Silas said. I heard the gun, Evan said. I know. Did you shoot someone? Silas crouched down to the boy's level, thought about the careful things adults say to children to manage the reality of what adults do, the softened versions that are technically true but leave out the weight. He thought about what Mara had said to the boy about being scared the truth of it, the simple form of it. Yes, he said. A man named Voss who was trying to hurt your mother. I shot him in the shoulder so he'd stop. He's alive and the deputy took him. Evan looked at him for a long moment. Were you trying to kill him? No. Why not? He hurt us for a long time. It was the kind of question only a child would ask. Not because children are cruel, but because they haven't yet developed the habit of not asking the things that adults have quietly decided not to ask. Silas thought about it. thought about Voss in the snow, deflated. The thing that had held him up all that time revealed to have been other people's fear and not anything in himself. Because killing him wouldn't have given you your land back, he said. Stopping him did. Those are different things. Evan turned the carved horse over in his hands. Mama says different things matter different amounts. Your mama's right. The boy looked at the fire. He killed my papa, he said. Not with a gun. But he did. The word landed in the room the way certain words do when a child says them, with the particular weight of someone who has been carrying a large thing, and has finally found a way to put it down. I know, Silas said. His voice was rough at the edges. He didn't fix it. Evan put the carved horse down on the floor in front of him and looked at it. Then he reached out, not looking up, and put his small hand over two of Silas's fingers and held them, the way he'd held them in the loft that first night when he was sleeping and didn't know he was doing it. This time he wasn't sleeping. He knew exactly what he was doing. Pa, he said very quietly. Just the word. Not a question, not a performance. Just a word being put down next to another word and seeing whether they fit together. Silas went very still. The fire burned. Mara, standing near the stove, had gone absolutely motionless. Silas looked at the boy's hand over his fingers. At the small carved horse on the floor between them, the neck fixed, the proportions better than the first attempt. He looked at the coat on the Peg Daniels coat, at the height that hadn't been relevant in 4 years, and he thought about all the things he had arranged his life to avoid feeling, the careful walls he had built and maintained and lived inside, as though maintenance were the same as living. He thought about the cabin, feeling like more than a place to survive. I'm here, he said. His voice held, barely, but it held. I'm not going anywhere. Evan looked up. His eyes were Thomas Whitlock's eyes, dark and very clear, and in them was the thing that children carry when they've been surviving alongside an adult. For long enough, the knowledge that the adult is also surviving, that the adult is also afraid, that the arrangement between them is not protection given by the strong to the weak, but something more complicated and more real and more worth having. Okay, Evan said. Not thank you. Not I knew it. Just okay. The word that means I understand and I believe you, and that is enough. Silas put his other hand over the boy's, and the three of them stayed like that for a moment. The boy and the man and the woman near the stove, who was not looking at either of them but was hearing all of it, and the fire burned, and the dark came down outside, and the cold settled in the sea, and way it does in January in the mountains, complete and absolute and indifferent, and inside the cabin the warmth was the other kind of warmth, the kind that has nothing to do with the fire. Later, after Evan was asleep, Mara stood at the window, looking out at the dark and the snow and the place where Voss had fallen and gotten up again and ridden away. He called you Pa, she said. I heard. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the stars were beginning to show through the cloud cover, the first clear sky in days. I didn't prompt that. I want you to know that. I know you didn't. She stopped. He's been watching you since the first morning. The way you mended the coat, the way you moved around him in the kitchen. She paused. He used to follow Thomas the same way, like learning the movements of a person you trust. Silas said nothing. There was nothing to add to that. He hasn't called anyone that since Thomas died, she said. I didn't know if he would again. I didn't know if the capacity for it was still there. Her voice had found a rough edge. She did not attempt to smooth it. He used to wake up calling for him. In the first months, he'd call out Pa in the middle of the night and then remember, and the remembering was... She stopped. You don't have to say it, Silas said. I know I don't have to. She turned from the window. He made a choice tonight. A 5-year-old made a choice with more honesty than most grown men manage in a lifetime, and I want you to know it wasn't. She looked at him. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't wishful thinking. He's been deciding for a week, and he made the decision, and I'm not going to apologize for it, or walk it back, or tell you to disregard it. Silas looked at her. I'm not asking you to make the same choice, she said. I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I just want you to know that whatever you are to him from here on out, he meant it, and I'll stand behind it. The room held the statement. Outside, the stars were clearer now, more of them appearing as the clouds thinned. The particular winter sky of the mountains that was enormous and cold, and full of light in spite of both. I meant it too, Silas said. When I said I wasn't going anywhere. She looked at him for a long moment, not with the measuring, calculating look she'd had in the first days. That look had been necessary, and she'd earned the right to it, and he understood that was something else. Something that came after the measuring. The look of a person who has assessed the ground carefully and has decided it will hold. She didn't say anything. She turned back to the window. Beckett said 2 months. For the court, she said. 2 or 3. And in the meantime? Silas looked at the fire. In the meantime, you're here, he said. Both of you. He paused. Cabin's got the loft. There's enough in the cellar to get through the winter. In spring, if the trail is clear, you can... He stopped. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what's possible. She looked at him over her shoulder. What if I told you I didn't want to go back to that land? Not because Voss scared me off it, but because... She stopped and looked at the window. Because when I think about that house, I think about the last good morning I had there. Thomas and Evan at the table, flour on the counter, the smell of it before anything went wrong. And I think if I go back there, I'll spend every morning in it trying to get back to that one morning, and I'll never manage it, and it'll eat me alive trying. Silas was quiet for a long time. Then we'd figure out something else to do with it, he said finally. The land's worth something. It's yours. You could sell it and be free of it, or let it, or... He looked at his hands. There are options. You're not obligated to live in every place you fight for. She turned from the window. That's a practical way to see it. I'm a practical man. She looked at him steadily. No, she said. You're not. You're a man who tells himself he's practical because it's easier than knowing what you actually are. He didn't argue. She was right, and arguing would have been dishonest. And between the two of them, they'd both run out of patience for dishonesty somewhere around the 3rd day. What am I then? He said. She looked at the coat on the peg, the mended shoulder seam on Evan's coat draped over the chair, the window and the stars showing through, and the place where the cold, dark yard held the impression of everything that had happened there today. Kind of man who mends a stranger's coat at midnight without being asked, she said, because the boy was cold and it needed doing. She looked back at him. That's what you are. Everything else is just what you tell yourself to keep the size of it manageable. Fire settled. The cabin breathed. Silas looked at the coat on the peg and then looked away, and this time the looking away was not the old kind, not avoidance, not the careful maintenance of a careful wall. It was simply the movement of someone who has acknowledged a thing and doesn't need to stand in front of it anymore to know it's there. You should sleep, he said. The ankle, I know. She took the crutch. At the foot of the loft ladder, she paused. Thank you, she said. Not for today. For the whole of it. You don't need to thank me. I know I don't need to, she said, which was what he'd said to her 8 days ago about the stew. He recognized it. He thought she knew he recognized it. She went up the ladder, careful and steady, and he listened to the sound of her moving in the loft, and then the quiet of it, and he sat by the fire for a while longer, not thinking exactly but being present in the way that you can be present in a space that has changed on you without warning, and you are still catching up to the change, still measuring the new dimensions of the thing you thought you knew. Stars were bright now. Fully clear, the clouds gone. Outside, the snow held the impressions of everything that had happened in the yard. The horses, the men, the moment. By morning, it would have shifted, the wind smoothing the surfaces, the hard edges softened, the depth of the prints shallower than they had been. By a week, it would be unreadable. But the record of it existed in other places now. In Beckett's case, in the deputy's report, in the testimony of witnesses, in the notarized affidavit that said, this woman's claim is real. It has a date and a signature and a history, and we saw it. Silas put more wood on the fire, and the fire took it, the way fire takes what it's given when it's burning right. He sat back in his chair. He did not feel peaceful exactly. Peace was not the word for what was sitting in his chest. But the thing that had been sitting there for 4 years, the specific weight of a life made small by choice, the maintained distance, the careful walls that thing had shifted, the way snow shifts when it's warming, not gone but changed, rearranged into something with less resistance in it. The carved horse was still on the floor where Evan had left it, neck fixed, legs right. The proportions of a horse that a 5-year-old had imagined and worked toward with the tools he'd been given. Silas looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the coat on the peg, at the height that had been irrelevant for 4 years. And he said nothing, and did nothing, and just sat with the fact of everything the cabin now contained. It was enough. The letter from Beckett arrived on a Tuesday in late March, carried up from Dalton Creek by a rider. Harlan had arranged to check the post on his behalf through the winter months. Silas brought it inside and set it on the table without opening it, which was not his letter to open. Mara was at the stove, her crutch leaning against the wall nearby, but not in her hand. She'd been moving without it, more often in the past 3 weeks. The ankle still not right, but closer to right, close enough that on good mornings she crossed the cabin without thinking about it, and only remembered on the return trip when the particular pull at the joint reminded her. She turned when she heard him come in and looked at the envelope and looked at his face and set down the spoon. She picked up the letter. She did not open it immediately. She stood holding it with both hands, and Silas watched her make the decision about whether she was ready for what was inside, which was its own kind of courage, not the courage of facing armed men in a yard, which required a different part of you, but the quieter courage of being willing to receive the outcome of something you have put everything into. She opened it. She read it standing. Her face did not change dramatically, which told him something. It moved through several things, a tightening, a release, something that was almost but not quite a full breath, and then it settled into an expression he hadn't seen on her before. He spent a moment identifying it before he understood that what he was seeing was the specific look of a person who has been proved right about something they were never completely certain of. And the being proved right is both a relief and a strange kind of grief, because it means the things was really happening all along, which you knew, but some part of you kept hoping you were wrong about. The deed is recognized, she said. The court found in my favor. She looked up. Voss's filing has been voided. The land is mine. Silas said, good. She looked back at the letter. He's been charged. Fraud conspiracy. She paused, and the mine. Beckett says the Denver report, the one Sykes mentioned, the private engineering assessment, the county prosecutor has it now. Someone in Voss's office kept a copy. Apparently. People keep things. Her voice had gone slightly unsteady. He's going to face charges for Thomas. The room was very quiet. Not the same as Thomas coming back, she said. No, Silas said. It's not. But it's something. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases. Thomas would have said it's the system working the way it's supposed to. He believed in that, the process. The right papers in the right hands. She set the letter on the table. I spent 14 months thinking his faith in the process was what got him killed. And now, she looked at the letter. Now I think the process worked. It just worked slowly, and while it was working, Voss was working faster. She paused. Thomas wasn't wrong. He just didn't have enough people around him. She looked at Silas. That was the missing piece, not the belief. The people. Silas thought about that for a moment. He thought about Harlan riding 2 days in the cold because Silas asked him. About Beckett, going through the records with the focused patience of a man who understood that paper was its own kind of power if you were willing to do the work. About a woman sewing a deed into a child's coat lining and walking out into a snowstorm because the alternative was surrender. You should tell Evan, he said. She looked toward the barn, where Evan had been since after breakfast, following Silas's morning routine with the focused dedication he'd applied to everything Silas did since the first week. She'd watched the attachment develop the way you watch. A plant grow, not event by event, but in the aggregate the accumulated weight of small moments, becoming something you couldn't have predicted from any single one of them. I will, she said. After I've sat with it for a minute, he left her to it. Outside the air was cold, but the cold had changed. It was March cold, not January cold still sharp, still capable of serious damage if you disrespected it, but the edge of it was different now. The edge of a season that is ending, rather than one fully committed to its own continuation. The snow was still deep in the shadows of the pines, but in the open yard it had pulled back from the fence posts, and you could see the dark soil at the base of things, the raw earth coming back to itself. He found Evan in the barn, standing on the second rail of the fence, around the small paddock where the pony lived. The pony was a gray-brown animal of uncertain temperament and advanced years named Fletcher, which had been her name when Silas acquired her from a man in Dalton Creek 2 winters ago, and he'd seen no reason to change it. Fletcher regarded Evan with the skeptical patience of an animal that has dealt with many small humans and has formed a nuanced opinion of the category. Evan was holding a piece of carrot at arm's length. Fletcher had not yet committed to taking it. "You have to be still," Silas said. "I am still. You're still-ish. She can feel your arm moving." Evan frowned, adjusted his grip, and went more still. Fletcher regarded him. Then she stepped forward and took the carrot, with the deliberate and entirely undramatic efficiency of an animal, doing a thing she'd decided to do on her own schedule and not a moment before. Evan exhaled. He looked at Silas with an expression that was trying not to be proud of itself and failing completely. "Took it," he said. "She did. She didn't before. Before you were moving too much." Silas climbed the rail beside him. "She needs to know you're not going to startle. Once she knows that, she decides you're worth trusting." Evan looked at Fletcher, who was regarding the space where the carrot had been with the philosophical equanimity of an old pony that has learned not to expect too much of the world. "How long does that take?" "For a horse to trust you?" "Depends on the horse," Silas said. "Some take a week. Some take a season. Fletcher took about a month before she'd let me brush her without laying her ears back. And now? Now she tolerates me, which is about as much as Fletcher offers anybody." Evan smiled. It was the full smile, the one that didn't arrive carefully or with any self-management, just Evan's face doing the thing it did when something was simply good. He looked young when he smiled like that, which Silas recognized was absurd because the boy was 5 and should look young always. But the truth was that in the months since January, Evan had mostly not looked entirely young. He had looked like someone carrying the particular weight that children carry when they have been surviving, alongside their mother, through something serious, and have understood more of it than they were meant to. The smile was the return of something that had been stored away. Silas was careful not to make a production of noticing it. "Your mother has a letter," Silas said. "From Beckett, the lawyer." Evan's face changed immediately. The smile went careful. "Does it say?" "She'll tell you herself." "I think it's good news." He paused. "It is good news, but it's hers to tell." Evan looked toward the cabin. Then he looked at Fletcher, who was now ignoring both of them with magnificent completeness. "If it's good news," Evan said slowly, "does that mean we go back?" The question sat in the cold air between them. Silas had been waiting for some version of this question. He had been waiting for it since the night Mara had stood at the window and said that she didn't know if she could go back to the homestead without spending every morning there trying to get back to the last good one. He had been waiting for it, and he had not prepared an answer, because the honest answer was not one he could give alone. "That's up to your mother," Silas said. Evan was quiet for a moment. He watched Fletcher. "What if she decides to stay here?" Silas looked at the boy on the fence rail, his turned-up collar, his mended coat shoulder, his carved horse in his coat pocket where it lived now, the neck properly proportioned, the legs right. "Then you'd stay here," Silas said. "Both of you. Would you want that?" The question was entirely direct, the way Evan's questions always were, without the social padding that adults learn to wrap around the things they actually meant. "That? Not would you allow it or would you mind, but the specific, unhedged question of desire." Silas took his time with it. "Yes," he said. "I would want that." Evan nodded, once firmly, as though checking something off. "Okay," he said. Then he held out the last piece of carrot to Fletcher, who this time took it without deliberating. Mara told Evan that afternoon, sitting at the table with the letter between them. And Evan listened to the whole of it, the deed, the court, Voss's charges with his hands flat on the table in front of him and his face very still, listening the way he listened when something was important enough to receive completely. When she finished, he said, "Is Voss going to jail?" "For a while," Mara said. "Maybe a long while." "And the mine? What happened to Papa?" "That'll take longer," she said. "Courts take time. The evidence is there now, Evan. It's in the right hands. Part of the record." She looked at him. "Your Papa kept copies of everything. He always said that what you write down exists, even when you can't see it anymore." He was right. Evan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table and then at his hands. "I'm glad," he said. Then more quietly, "And I'm still mad." Mara looked at him. "You're allowed to be both. Are you?" She thought about that with the honesty it deserved. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I am." Evan looked at the letter. "Can we keep it, the letter?" "Of course. Papa would have kept it," Evan said. "He would have put it with the deed and kept them together." He paused. "We should put them together." Mara folded the letter and picked up the deed from where she'd set it on the shelf above the stove. The place where important things lived in this cabin now, without anyone having formally decided that. She put them together and held the small stack of paper in both hands and looked at it. Thomas's handwriting on one, Beckett's careful legal script on the other. The beginning and the end of it held together. "There's something else," she said. She looked at Evan. "I need to talk to you about where we're going to live." Evan glanced toward the door, in the direction of the barn where Silas was doing the afternoon work. "I know what I want," he said. "Tell me." He looked at her directly. "I want to stay here," he said. "With Silas. I want this to be home." She held his gaze. "That's what you want. What do you think I want?" Evan considered her face, the way he'd been doing, since he was old enough to understand that faces contained information. He was very good at it by now. "I think you want the same thing," he said. "But you're taking longer to say it." She was quiet. "Am I wrong?" he said. "No," she said. "You're not wrong." She looked at the documents in her hands. "I've been afraid that wanting something for myself is that if I want something for myself, it means I'm forgetting your father." Evan was quiet for a moment. He had the expression of a 5-year-old who has encountered an adult belief that doesn't hold together and is trying to find the right way to say so. "Mama," he said, "you think about Papa all the time. I can tell when you're doing it. Your face goes a certain way." He paused. "Wanting to stay here doesn't make you do that face less. The same face either way." Mara looked at her son, 31 years old, and a 5-year-old had just handed her something she'd been unable to work out for herself. She thought about Thomas's faith in the process, the patience of it, the willingness to believe that truth well documented would eventually find its way to the right hands. She thought about how that faith had seemed naive until it didn't. She thought about how it was possible to carry someone with you into the next place, how the carrying wasn't betrayal but continuance, how the destination didn't have to cancel the journey to get there. "You're very smart," she said. "I know," Evan said, without any self-consciousness at all. "Can I go tell Silas we're staying?" "Let me tell him," she said. "You can come." They found him splitting wood behind the barn, which was where he went when he was doing something that didn't require thinking. And the rhythm of it, the lift, the set, clean fall had the particular quality of a man who had been processing something the only way he knew how without admitting to himself that's what he was doing. He stopped when he saw them coming around the corner, and he set the axe down against the block, and he waited. Mara stopped a few feet away. Evan stopped beside her. "The land is mine," she said. "The court confirmed it. Voss is facing charges, I know," he said. "You told me." "I know I told you." She looked at him. "I'm telling you again because I want to say the next part, and I needed a place to start." He waited. "I'm not going back to that land," she said, "not to live on it. I'm going to sell it, and I'm going to use what I get from it to invest in something else." She looked at the cabin, at the barn, at the fence line running east toward the pasture, at the place where the snow was pulling back from the base of the fence posts, and the dark soil was beginning to show. Something here, she said. If that's acceptable. Silas was quiet for a long moment. More cattle, he said finally. East pasture can carry more, and the fence on the south side needs replacing before summer. She looked at him. Is that a yes? That's a list of things we'd need to do, he said, which assumes you're staying. It assumes we're staying, she said. All of us, permanently. I'm not asking for a season, and I'm not asking to be a boarder. I'm asking, she stopped. I'm asking if you mean what you said to Evan in the barn this morning. He looked at Evan, who looked back at him, with the frank, steady gaze of a child who has decided not to pretend he wasn't listening. That wasn't a private conversation, Evan said helpfully. Clearly, Silas said. He looked at Mara. The afternoon light was the particular pale gold of early March. Not warm exactly, but the suggestion of warmth, the rehearsal of it. Her hair was pulled back simply, and she had flour on her sleeve from the morning, and she was watching him with the same look she'd had. The night after Voss was taken away, not the measuring look, not the calculating look, but the one that came after all of that, the look of someone who has assessed the ground and decided it will hold. I meant it, he said. Everything I said in the barn. And before that, he paused. I'm not good at talking about these things. I've noticed, she said. I'm better at. He gestured at the split wood, the barn, the fence line, the accumulated evidence of a person who showed what they meant rather than saying it. I know, she said. I've noticed that too. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out something he'd been carrying for 3 days. Since the morning after the letter from Beckett arrived, when he'd gone to the cedar chest in the corner and opened it for the first time in 4 years and stood looking at what was inside until he understood what he was doing there. It was a ring, silver, worn smooth at the band, a simple thing without ornamentation. Clara's ring, from a time before the fever, from a time when the cabin had held a different kind of fullness. He held it out, not on one knee, not with a speech prepared, just held it out in the palm of his hand. In the cold afternoon, a man standing in the mud at the edge of winter, offering a small worn thing to a woman who had walked out of a snowstorm carrying her child and her dead husband's deed, and the absolute, unbendable refusal to be made nothing by someone who had decided she was worth nothing. You can stay as long as you want, he said, even forever. Mara looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at his face. She reached out and closed her fingers around the ring and held it, not putting it on yet just holding it. Think I'm already home, she said. Evan, standing between them, looked at the ring and at Silas, and then at his mother, with the expression of a child witnessing something that he understands completely and intends to remember. Does this mean we're a family? He asked. Silas looked down at him. What do you think it means? Evan thought about it with the seriousness he applied to important questions. I think it means yes, he said. But I wanted to check. It means yes, Silas said. Evan nodded, once, with the decisive satisfaction of a person who has verified a fact and can now proceed on the basis of it. Then he turned and went back toward the barn, presumably to tell Fletcher. Spring came the way it always does in the mountains, not all at once, not cleanly, but in arguments with winter that winter slowly lost. A warm day followed by 3 cold ones, the snow retreating and retreating further, the creek beginning to move under its ice, the sound of water running reaching the cabin on certain mornings before the temperature dropped again and quieted it. Evan learned to ride Fletcher. This was a longer project than he had patience for, and a shorter project than Fletcher had patience for. And the truth was that the pony tolerated his learning the way she tolerated most things, with a resigned, limited cooperation that made her feelings clear, while still technically allowing the thing to proceed. By mid-April, he could walk her in a circle around the paddock without Silas on the rail. By early May, he could trot, badly, which was the way trotting always started. Silas watched him from the fence without coaching unless he was asked. He'd learned early that unsolicited instruction from him produced a specific expression on Evan's face, the expression of a person who understands the instruction and would have appreciated being allowed to figure it out, and so he had adjusted. He offered tools. He answered questions. He waited to be asked. This turned out to be, improbably, exactly the right approach. Mara's ankle healed completely by April, or healed to the degree that ankles heal when they've been badly rolled in the cold and then walked on for weeks, which is to say, it was functional and reliable on good days and stiff on cold mornings, and occasionally reminded her of its history with a particular kind of ache that was not pain exactly but information. She had decided she could live with information. She planted a kitchen garden along the southeast side of the cabin, which got the most light. She was not a practiced gardener. That had always been Thomas's domain. The careful attention of someone who found growing things satisfying in a way that matched his temperament. He was rougher with it than he would have been, more impatient, less careful about the spacing. But the seeds went in, and the soil was good, and things came up, not all of them, and not always in the right places, but enough. Silas watched her garden the way she watched him build things, with the attention of someone learning a person's method. The particular way they approached a problem, what they cared about, and what they were willing to let be imperfect. What he learned was that Mara Whitlock was a woman who could sustain effort over a very long time, which he already knew, but also one who needed things to respond to her quickly enough to confirm she was moving in the right direction. She could not garden with Thomas's patience. She could not wait months for evidence. She'd learned to read faster signals, the subtle changes in a person's face, the quality of a silence, the small adjustments that told her something had shifted without anyone announcing it. This made her very good at reading him, which he had not expected and was still adjusting to. "You're thinking about Daniel," she said one evening in May. Without looking up from the pot she was stirring. He was sitting at the table with nothing in his hands, which was unusual enough to be readable. "Yes," he said. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No," he said. Then, after a moment, maybe. She turned the flame down and turned around and sat across from him. She didn't say anything. She just sat. This was something she did that he had come to understand as deliberate the sitting without filling the space. It was harder than it looked. Most people filled space automatically, the way they breathed. Mara had learned to stop doing it, or had always known how. He wasn't sure which. Either way, the space she left was the kind that you could actually put something into. He would have been 9 this year, Silas said. March, she said. She remembered the dates. He'd mentioned it once, briefly, and she'd held it. He was quiet, Silas said. Like his mother, Clara was quiet. She had a way of being in a room that didn't take up much noise but took up a lot of presence. You knew she was there, he paused. Daniel was the same. He'd follow me to the barn the way Evan follows me, but he didn't ask as many questions. He just watched. That must have been different, she said. Not a judgment, just an observation. Different from Evan. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, not better or worse, just different. He looked at the table. I spent a long time trying not to compare, because comparing felt like I don't know. Like the wrong thing to do. Might just be the human thing to do, she said. People compare. It doesn't mean one has to cancel the other. He looked at her. You're not replacing them, she said. We're not replacing them. Evan and I are not. We're not here to fill the space where Daniel and Clara were. We're here in different space. She paused. There's enough room. There has always been enough room. That's not a problem you need to solve. He was quiet for a long time. I know that, he said. I know you know it, she said. Sometimes knowing it and believing it take different amounts of time. The fire burned. Outside, the evening had gone the deep blue of late spring, almost warm enough to leave the door open. Not quite. In the paddock, Fletcher would be standing in the corner she preferred, the southwest corner, for reasons known only to Fletcher. Clara would have liked you, Silas said. She had no patience for people who performed things. She liked people who did things. Mara looked at him steadily. I think Thomas would have found you frustrating to get to know, she said, and then decided you were worth the effort and committed to you completely, because that's what he did with everything that mattered to him. Something's in Silas's face moved not quite a smile, something older than a smile, The expression of a man receiving something he hadn't known he needed. That sounds right, he said. I think the people we loved would have approved of this, she said. I don't say that to comfort you. I say it because I actually believe it. She looked at her hands. Thomas believed that a good life was not a monument to any particular moment in it. He believed it was a series of decisions, kept or not kept, that said something about what you were. She looked up. You have kept your decisions. Every single one since the night we showed up in your yard. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that would improve on what she'd said. She got up and went back to the stove. He watched her, the familiar efficiency of her movements, the flour-dusted sleeve that seemed to be a permanent feature now, the way she pushed a piece of hair back without thinking. The cabin felt the way it felt now, full, in a way that was not crowded, occupied in a way that was not pressured. He had been afraid, in the early weeks, that the feeling would diminish, that it was a product of the immediate crisis, and would thin out when the crisis was resolved. He'd expected the ordinary dailiness of things to reveal a gap between what he'd imagined and what was real. What he'd found instead was that the ordinary dailiness was the thing. Coffee in the morning, Evan's questions, the sound of Mara reading by firelight, Fletcher being difficult, the fence that needed repair, and the cellar that needed organizings, and all the small necessary work of a place that was lived in rather than merely maintained. This, apparently, was what he'd been maintaining the place for. He hadn't known that when he built it. Beckett's final letter came in June, confirming that Gideon Voss had accepted a court settlement on the civil charges and was awaiting trial on the criminal matter. The sale of Mara's original homestead had been completed through Beckett's office fair value, paid by a family from the East who were coming out to the frontier with hope and no particular knowledge of what they were getting into, which was how most people arrived. Mara held the bank draft for a long moment before she endorsed it and handed it to Silas to take into Dalton Creek when he went for supplies. Split it, she said. It's your money. We're buying cattle with it and replacing the south fence, she said. That makes it investment, not mine. Split it. He took the draft without further argument because they'd had this conversation twice already and she had not moved on it. They bought 6 more cattle, which brought the herd to 14, and they replaced the south fence, which took 2 weeks, and the help of Harlan Mercer for 3 days in the middle of it. Harlan worked without talking much, which was his mode, and in the evenings he sat on the porch with Silas, and they talked the way men who have known each other a long time talk in short exchanges, with long silences between them that carried as much as the words. She's settled in, Harlan said one evening, nodding toward the cabin where the lamplight was visible through the window. Yes, Silas said. Good. Harlan was quiet for a while. You look different, do I? Less like a man waiting for something to go wrong. Silas looked at the last light over the ridge. Maybe I stopped waiting. Harlan made a sound that was roughly his version of a laugh. Took you long enough. It took what it took, Silas said. Harlan nodded, accepting this as sufficient, which it was. In the end, what this story is really about is not land, though land matters. It is not even justice. Though justice arrived, imperfectly and late, and with the edges of it ragged in the way that real justice always is, never the clean thing that the word implies. What this story is about is the particular human capacity to keep going past the point at which going seems reasonable. Mara Whitlock had every justification to stop. She had lost her husband to a man's greed, and her home to his paperwork, and her safety to his hired men, and she had a child to protect, and an injury that made walking painful, and the entirety of winter in front of her. She could have given up the deed. She could have accepted less. She could have decided that survival at any cost was the right arithmetic. She didn't. Not because she was fearless, she told her son plainly that she was afraid. Not because she was certain, she carried the deed for 14 months, without knowing if it would be enough. She kept going because she understood something that takes most people a lifetime to learn, if they learn it at all, that giving up what is rightfully yours is not the same as surviving, that there is a version of being alive, in which you have traded the substance of yourself for the continuation of your body, and that this is not the same bargain it appears to be in the moment when it's offered. Silas Rourke had made a different kind of error. He had protected himself so thoroughly from the possibility of loss that he had also protected himself from the possibility of anything else. He had confused the maintenance of a life with the living of one. He had kept the coat on the peg and the cabin in good repair and done everything right and felt nothing. And he had told himself this was enough because the alternative was too large to look at. It took a 5-year-old with a carved horse in his pocket to look at it for him. The truth that both of them arrived at slowly, imperfectly, without any clean moment of revelation, is one that this world has been demonstrating since the first person decided to build a fire and invite someone else to come sit near it, that the life you can make alone is always smaller than the life you can make with someone beside you. Not because you are weak, but because you are human, and humans were built for the presence of other humans the way wood is built. For fire, it can exist without it, but existence is not the same thing as purpose. Mara did not forget Thomas in that cabin. She carried him into it, in the deed she'd preserved, and in the son who had his eyes, and in the particular faith in documentation and process that Thomas had taught her, and that had, in the end, been exactly right. Silas did not forget Clara and Daniel. He kept the coat on the peg, and when Evan moved into the cabin as its permanent small resident, he moved around the coat with a natural respect that he'd never been asked to have. And that said something about the kind of child he was, or the kind he was becoming. Dead are not replaced. They are carried. The shape of them changes as you carry them, worn smooth by the years like river stone, but they are there. They are in the way you do certain things, the way certain words land in your chest, the way the coat on the peg can be both a grief and eventually, carefully, is a different kind of monument. The ring on Mara's finger was small and worn and ordinary, the kind of ring that no one who didn't know the story would look at twice. She wore it with the same practical awareness with which she did everything, knowing what it was and what it wasn't, and being at peace with both. It was not a replacement. It was a continuation. Thomas had believed that a good life was a series of decisions kept, and she was keeping the most important one, which was the decision to remain, fully and without reservation, in the world. Evan grew, as children do, faster than seems reasonable, in ways that are visible only in retrospect, the sudden fit of a coat that had been too large, the voice that deepens at the edges, the questions that change from how to why. He learned to ride Fletcher properly, and Fletcher eventually extended to him the modest honor of her full cooperation, which was the most Fletcher offered anyone, and was, in its way, enough. He learned to mend a seam and read a trail, and identify clouds by type, the last of these being a hobby Silas had never mentioned but apparently harbored, producing a battered book on the subject from the bottom of the cedar chest one afternoon in a way that suggested he'd forgotten he owned it. He kept the carved horse on the shelf in the cabin, in a place of honor it occupied without ceremony. The neck was right. The legs were right. The proportions were those of a horse that a 5-year-old had imagined and worked toward with a small knife and the patience of someone who had been told the truth about the neck and decided to fix it. He had learned that things worth having were worth fixing. The summer turned gold, and then the gold turned to the particular copper and rust of early fall, and the frost came back to the edges of mornings, and the mountains that surrounded the valley turned from green to the colors of a fire burning down, and the cabin held what it held: the warmth of the stove, the sound of 3 people who had learned each other's movements well enough to share a small space without difficulty, the letter from Beckett and the original deed held together on the shelf, the coat on the peg, Fletcher in the paddock being philosophical about the frost, and the vast frontier sky above all of it, indifferent and enormous and full of light. The same sky that had watched Mara walk out of a homestead with her child and her deed and nothing else. The same sky that had watched Silas build a small life and maintain it carefully and call that enough doing what skies do, holding everything underneath it, without judgment, without preference, waiting to see what the people below would make of the time they had. What they made of it was this: a family, chosen rather than given, which is the harder kind to build and the more durable kind to keep. A home, which is never just the structure, but always the accumulation of the small decisions that say, here, this is the place. This is where I will be present, and difficult, and honest, and imperfect, and unwilling to leave. A life, which is the only thing any of us are actually making. Whether we know it or not, whether we intend it or not, in every choice we make to stand rather than retreat, to stay rather than run, open the door rather than let the cold decide for us.